Hey guys, welcome to AP Biology on the lecture on species concepts, sources of genetic variation. So just taking a quick look at this picture, you can see that there are multiple sources of or multiple types of variation in this particular picture in hair texture, skin color, height, and all of these girls are the same age. And so again, remember natural selection works on the phenotype and it works on the whole organism. I just wanted to say that as we went into this particular lecture. So what are some of the sources of genetic variation in natural populations? So the most important thing on this particular slide is that first statement. Natural selection requires genetic variation in order to work. Because once again, if all organisms were the same, if there was a change in that particular environment, it might wipe out the entire population. But with variation, that would allow some individuals to survive and then reproduce in that new changed environment. Remember that mutations in the germ cells, i.e., the sperm and egg cells, are the only source for new alleles. And mutations, once again, can occur in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And then the process of sexual reproduction and meiosis does create individuals that have new combinations of alleles. And you should remember how that happens back in meiosis through the process of crossing over, independent assortment, and then random fertilization. Uh, the fact that in most sexually reproducing organisms are diploid organisms, meaning they have two sets of chromosomes, and that makes it very difficult sometimes for recessive alleles to be weeded out of a population because they can be masked from natural selection by dominant alleles. Okay. And the other thing I do want to mention here is this concept of outbreeding. And that basically means the opposite of inbreeding, okay, where organisms are going outside of their family, outside sometimes of their local population in order to mate with individuals that are not close genetically. Okay, and there are lots of different mechanisms that do exist amongst both plants and animals that are going to promote outbreeding. Okay, as I said earlier, mutations are the source of new alleles, and as we learned when we talked about DNA reproduction or duplicate replication, that mutations are pretty rare because of DNA polymerase checks for those mistakes. And again, every time your cells divide, there are about 30 mutations in your DNA. The other thing I want you to remember again, is that mutations in somatic cells, i.e., all your cells except for your gametes, your sperm and egg, those cannot be passed on to the next generation. Okay? Mutations must occur in the germ cells in order for mutations to be passed on to new generations. And again, these gross abnormalities, such as you see legs instead of antenna, are usually weeded out very quickly. And in humans, that would result, and other mammals would generally result in a spontaneous miscarriage, and that young would not be produced. Okay, so once again, evolution does begin with alterations in that genetic message, and we've already mentioned mutations. There can be gene transfer and transposition, which can alter the gene location. And sometimes, if the gene location is altered, that can potentially mean that that gene is silenced, or it might even alter the function of that particular gene. Or if a chunk of DNA gets put into the middle of a gene, it may actually shut that gene off. That will alter the genetic, or I should say, the genome of that particular organism. We've talked about recombination, and again, that's the shuffling of genes in alleles that happens during meiosis and so on and so on. And then, of course, chromosomal rearrangement, where the entire organization or the entire chromosome is somehow altered. Now, the picture off to the left here looks at human chromosome number 2, which is on the far left. Okay, and human chromosome, and then chimp and gorilla chromosomes 2 and 3. What I do want you to notice is that we the evidence points to about 7 million years ago that the organism that was neither chimp nor human, uh, it was our common ancestor. There was a chromosomal mutation which resulted in these two chromosomes, what would eventually become chromosomes 2 and 3 in chimps, to combine to form human chromosome number 2. And as you notice, look at the banding patterns. They are very similar between the human chromosome number 2 and then chromosomes 2 and 3 in our ape cousins. So, the other thing that can alter the genetics of a population is genetic drift. And that's what is genetic drift? It's basically when chance events lead to changes in the gene pool. Okay. And in this, there are basically two modes of genetic drift. One is called the bottleneck effect. And in the bottleneck effect, basically what's happening is that something, a disease, a natural event, a catastrophe goes through the population and wipes out most of the population, and only a few individuals survive. And it may not represent the entire gene pool. Matter of fact, it may even all of a sudden make alleles that were once rare become common. And if you look at this particular diagram, we're starting off with a parent population with yellow and blue. Some sort of chance event only allows a few individuals to survive. And as you notice, the surviving individuals now have more of the blue than the yellow. And so our next generation is going to have a altered gene pool where the blue alleles are now much more common than they were in the past. A couple of examples. This has happened in cheetahs. Cheetahs were once widespread, going all the way over into India. Now they are only found in sub-Saharan Africa. And it has been hypothesized that about 10,000 years ago, some sort of virus went through that population and wiped out these individuals. And so they have a very limited genetic variability, which leads to all sorts of problems. The other one is called the founder effect, and it's very similar. And the founder effect is when a small portion of a population splits off from the main population, again, not taking the entire set of the gene pool, but only a small subset of that gene pool, the alleles present in that gene pool, and they start a separate population that no longer has a genetic connection to the original population. And again, the effects can be the same, or the outcomes can be the same, in basically how once rare alleles can become common or how many alleles can be lost. And this is more common in small populations. Now, natural selection can actually decrease genetic variation. You may wonder, how can that happen? Well, natural selection is going to eliminate those, not maybe 100%, but eliminate those alleles which would be deleterious or not good for that particular group of species. And we've also talked about the process of homozygosity. And again, that is when there is no variation at all in maybe one trait. So maybe everybody has blue eyes in that particular population. And we say that if that happens, that's when that allele has become fixed and we have lost genetic diversity there. We will talk a little bit about heterozygosity and balancing selection. And again, that's when heterozygotes do have a selective advantage. It's relatively rare, but we've already mentioned sickle cell anemia, how that is a benefit to individuals living in areas where there is malaria, and possibly cystic fibrosis as cholera epidemic swept across northern Europe. Being a carrier for that allele, the cystic fibrosis allele, which is a chlorine transporter protein, may have given some people an advantage and it allowed them to survive at a higher rate when cholera hit. Okay. Sexual selection, okay, can also decrease genetic variation. Again, sexual selection, when females or males are choosing their partners based on certain characteristics. And so those characteristics become more prevalent in a population, and the ones that they replace become less prevalent. And of course, we've already mentioned genetic drift, change in allele frequency due to chance alone. So, what increases genetic variation? As we mentioned earlier, mutation, recombination, again during meiosis, and gene flow. That is the movement of individuals into a population from a different population. There's also selection to avoid predators, and we looked at this in the rock pocket mouse, and these can be both positive and negative. Again, if you are a black mouse living on a white background, that would be a negative selective factor. But if you're a dark mouse living on a dark background, then that would be a positive selective factor. And the opposite for a white mouse living on a white background would be positive, and a white mouse living on a dark background would be a negative selective factor. So, and again, as we saw in the film, these changes can happen very, very, very quickly. Now, the fact that most animals are diploid, meaning they have one set of chromosomes from mom and one set of chromosomes from dad, and that it takes at least two alleles for every single trait. Okay, even though natural selection reduces variation, it's very difficult to get rid of recessive alleles, mainly because they can be hidden in the heterozygotes, where the dominant allele will mask that recessive allele. Now, this term polymorphism, let's break it down. Poly means many, and morph means sort of shape or size or whatever. Okay? And basically, polymorphism occurs when two or more discrete characters. What the heck is a discrete character? Well, as we saw earlier, skin color and height are quantitative characters, meaning the more genes you have that code for maybe being tall, the taller you will be. Discrete characters are more like Mendelian traits, single gene factors. You're either this or you're that. In this particular case, you're either an orange butterfly or a black butterfly, and these are members of the same species. Okay. So that's an example of polymorphism, and maybe one morph does better in a certain habitat, and the other one does better in a different habitat. We've already talked about balanced polymorphism, and again, that example would be the sickle cell anemia, where again, individuals that carry that sickle cell allele, either heterozygous, have a greater survivorship and reproductive success than the homozygotes. Either you don't carry the sickle cell allele at all, and more likely to die from malaria during childhood, or you're homozygous for the sickle cell allele, and you're more likely to die unless you get medical care. And again, that sickle cell allele is found predominantly in regions where malaria is present. And as I say up here, we'll just look at it. The sickle cell allele may reach 20% of the gene pool, okay, in places where malaria is very high. In the U.S., we got about 8 to 10% of African Americans do carry the allele, which is much less than you would see in places such as sub-Saharan Africa. And again, because there's no selective factor to carry that particular allele in our environment, so it is selected against. And again, evolutionary fitness. What is it? It's your ability to leave offspring or contribute to the gene pool through the number of offspring you leave. Okay? And there are a lot of different factors that play a role in that. And again, mostly it's reproductive success. Do you survive and reproduce in the first place? How many offspring do you produce per individual? What factors do you have that allow you to avoid being eaten by something else? What factors, genetic characteristics, do you have that allow you to gather more food at a better rate than someone else? Or what characteristics do you have that allow you to attract or defend uh, mates? So these are all factors that go into the reproductive success of any organism, whether plant or animal. And so when you're looking at these things, think about why are poisons found in many plants? Okay. Or even in animals that don't move very fast. It's because it makes them more likely to survive being eaten by something. Okay. And then once again, survival alone does not guarantee reproductive success. If the organism is sterile or does not survive to reproduce, their fitness is zero. And do remember, it is the phenotype that interacts with the environment, and natural selection or selection of any sorts acts on the phenotype. Okay, so again, remember, if you're genotype, you might be heterozygous and you have a recessive allele that is not good to have, but you have a dominant allele that hides it, then selection cannot act on that heterozygote. Okay. Um, Also, the selection can be one of three different variations, and we need to know these. It can be directional, diversifying, or stabilizing. So let's look at this picture here. Our original population, a nice bell-shaped curve of light to dark mice. If directional selection occurs, then that curve is going to shift. In this case, it's going to favor the darker mice, such as the mice that are found on the dark rock lava in the deserts of the Mojave Desert. Diversifying selection. This is also occurring in the Mojave Desert, where light mice are going to be found on the sand and the dark mice are going to be found on the rock. And this can oftentimes lead to speciation because there might be some reproductive barriers that are going to develop there. Stabilizing selection is when the extremes are selected against and the average is the one that is selected for. Okay, and again, I talk about human birth weights here. Generally, prior to medical intervention or in places where there is no medical intervention, children that are usually less than 5 pounds have a hard time surviving, and children that are over 8 pounds oftentimes lead to death of the mother and child during childbirth. So that there has been a stabilizing selection for children to be born somewhere between 5 and 8 pounds. Good example of diversifying selection can be found in some finches out in West Africa. And this small beaked finch, as you see here on the left-hand side, remember, they're the same species, okay? But this small beaked finch is found in the forest, and in the grasslands that surround the forest, you find a large beaked finch. Excuse me, it's the opposite way around. The seed crackers with the small beaks are found in the grasslands, and the ones with the larger beaks are found in the forest because the ones with the larger beaks are feeding on small nuts that are much larger than the grass seeds found in the grasslands. They are members of the same species and in the process of probably undergoing a speciation event. Sexual selection is a fascinating topic because it has led to all sorts of really cool and interesting adaptations. And usually, number one, it results in sexual dimorphism. What's that mean? Well, in this picture of some Laws parodias, which are found in New Guinea, and back in the mid 1980s, I spent a year in New Guinea working on these birds. But we have the female, this dull brown female, and we have these flamboyant males. And the females choose the males based on their ability to dance and to build a dance court in the middle of the forest. And if you want to see a great video, click on this link, okay, or just search Birds of the Gods or Birds of Paradise or Laws Parodia on Google, and you will come up with some great videos of these guys. They're really amazing. Okay, so there are two different types of sexual selection. There's intrasexual, where males are competing with each other for females, and that usually leads to aggression, increased size in the males, and being males being very aggressive. And then there's intersexual, and that's where the females are generally choosing males for oftentimes what we call maladaptive traits. Okay, and again, this was something that really vexed Darwin. Whereas, why did peacocks have these massive tails, which made them more likely to be eaten by predators because they couldn't fly so quick? All right. So why is there not perfection in evolution? Why are we not the perfect organism out there? Why do we have these bad knees? Why do we have bad backs? Why do we have a blind spot in our eye? There's all these things. Well, number one, it's because natural selection doesn't create new things from nothing. It tinkers with existing structures. Okay, and that tinkering are oftentimes compromises. Okay. And oftentimes, one of the mistakes people always make is that they say, well, evolution leads to perfection. Well, sometimes it's not really adaptive. It could be a result of a process where the gene pool frequency has changed due to maybe a meteorite crashing down. And the individuals that survive because of luck. And that's about it. And so and of course, now your gene pool is limited, and the individuals that evolve from that group don't have that full set of tools in their gene pool toolkit, and therefore they're kind of limited by that. And again, that last quote, selection can only edit existing variations, and that's it. Well, that's it for lecture number 1. We will do the next